All right, so today we're going to dive into this preprint, multi-agent systems powered by large language models, applications in swarm intelligence.
Ooh, very cool.
Yeah, so for our short form listeners, basically what happened was researchers built this tool that uses LLMs, specifically GPT-4o,
Okay.
to control these agents and simulations. And they got some pretty interesting results in like classic swarm intelligence scenarios, ants foraging and bird flocking.
Right, yeah.
And it turns out these LLM-driven agents, they can actually like mimic the behavior we see in like traditional rule-based systems.
Interesting.
And sometimes they even like outperform them, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
This is like a completely new way to study like self-organization and emergent behavior.
Yeah, this preprint really is diving into a cutting-edge area, right? It's taking us beyond those pre-programmed rules that we usually use for agent behavior. Instead, it's harnessing the power of language models to drive those actions. Especially like with swarm intelligence, I think it's a fresh perspective on how we simulate these complex systems.
For sure. And for you, I know you're really into keeping up with the latest in AI research, especially these innovative applications of these foundational models. This paper is definitely a must-read. I think we should really dig into how these researchers replace those like rigid agent rules with prompts fed to an LLM.
Yeah.
And then we could explore like the surprising results they found when they simulated, these classic examples, ant foraging, bird flocking.
Yeah, and what's really cool, I think, is the toolchain that they built. The paper goes into detail on how they integrated GPT-4o with NetLogo, which, for our listeners who may not be familiar, it's a widely used platform, especially in the complexity science community. It's really good for modeling interactions between tons of individual agents.
Yeah, and the key here is NetLogo's Python extension. Right?
Exactly.
So think of it as like a translator. So NetLogo can encode all this real-time information from the simulation environment and send it as prompts to the OpenAI API. And then it takes the LLM suggestions for behavior and translates that back into actions that agents can actually perform in the simulation.
Right.
So it's a real-time feedback loop that makes this dynamic, context-aware behavior possible.
Yeah, and what's cool is the researchers didn't just like try one approach to guide these LLM-powered agents.
Right.
They had two main strategies. One was, with really structured rule-based prompts, which are designed to get very specific actions in response to like particular environmental conditions. And then the other strategy used more autonomous principle-based prompts, which is more about tapping into the LLM's inherent understanding of concepts like flocking to guide behavior.
Okay, that's fascinating. So we should definitely dig into the specifics of how those different prompting methods, rule-based versus principle-based, were applied to these core examples, right?
Yeah.
The classic ant colony foraging model where like communication through pheromones is key.
Right.
And then the self-organizing behavior of bird flocks, which is, based on Craig Reynolds Boyd's model.
Yeah. So the paper lays out its objectives, really clearly.
Okay.
First, they wanted to see how well-structured prompts could do in a rule-driven and foraging simulation.
Okay.
Which, as you said, that's like a classic model for studying swarm intelligence.
Yeah, totally.
And then on the other side, they also wanted to assess how principle-based prompts could guide a bird flocking simulation, which relies on like general behavioral principles rather than like strict predefined rules for every single interaction. That's another benchmark for studying, self-organization.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And really importantly, a key aim of this work was to present this whole integrated toolchain.
Yeah.
The combination of LLMs and multi-agent simulation environments as a new way to analyze swarm behavior in complex systems. It's really about giving us like a new lens to investigate these phenomena.
This research is, as the paper points out, not happening in a vacuum.
Of course, yeah.
It builds on a growing body of work that explores how generative AI, particularly LLMs, can be integrated into multi-agent systems. And the overall goal here is to, give agents more autonomy and create these more realistic, nuanced behaviors.
Exactly. So the paper mentions a bunch of related areas, like, research on LLM-driven agents that can do natural language communication, simulations of social networks that are like powered by the language understanding of these models, and even using LLMs to improve decision-making in AI agents in complex environments, like, Minecraft, for example.
Yeah, and it's not just limited to virtual spaces either. The researchers highlight recent efforts to, like, incorporate LLMs into physical systems. So think about coordinating the movements of robot swarms or orchestrating the flight of unmanned aerial vehicles. It really shows the potential of this kind of integration.
All right, so let's break down this toolchain they developed. It's the engine that makes this whole thing possible. The first key component is what they call environment encoding.
Okay, so this is where NetLogo is constantly monitoring the state of the simulation.
Yeah.
So it's gathering all the essential information, like the positions of the agents, how they're interacting, any relevant environmental factors like, an ant simulation, the concentration, location of pheromones. And then this raw data needs to be converted into a format that the LLM can understand. So they call it encoding it into structured prompts.
Right. So that leads directly to the second component, the integration via NetLogo's Python extension.
Okay.
This is like the vital bridge. It lets NetLogo talk to external systems. In this case, the OpenAI API, where GPT-4o is, it's the messenger that takes those encoded prompts and sends them to the LLM.
Okay.
So once the prompt arrives at GPT-4o, then you get to the LLM processing stage. The language model analyzes all this information.
Yeah.
That snapshot of the simulation environment, and based on, this context and the type of prompt that it got, it generates suggestions for how the agent should behave next.
Okay.
So following the LLM processing, you have decoding LLM output. The LLM sends back its suggestions, in a structured format, often as a JSON object or a Python dictionary. And this output then needs to be translated back into a language that NetLogo can understand and execute.
Right.
The Python extension plays another key role here. It takes that data from the LLM and turns it into commands within the simulation.
So those decoded commands can be quite varied, right?
Yeah.
So for an ant, it might be an instruction to move forward, rotate a certain way, pick up food if it's there, drop a pheromone, drop food at the nest. For a bird, it might be adjusting its heading.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool.
And finally, we get to agent action execution and iteration.
Right.
So NetLogo has the decoded commands. It tells the agents to carry them out, which, obviously updates the environment. And this is where the feedback loop comes in.
Mm-hmm.
The new state of the environment informs the next round of prompts that go to the LLM, and the whole thing repeats. It's this, constant sensing, prompting, executing, updating that drives these simulations.
So let's get into the first experiment, which was all about that classic ant colony foraging simulation.
Okay, yeah.
And the researchers here were really interested in how well those structured rule-based prompts could guide the ant's behavior.
So the environment they built in NetLogo had a central nest and several food sources scattered around. The goal was to copy how real ants, discover food and use pheromones to communicate.
Right. And what's really neat is that these individual ant agents were stateless.
Stateless, okay.
Yeah. So each ant was making decisions just based on the immediate information it was getting from its surroundings and the prompt from the LLM. It didn't have any memory of past actions or experiences.
Interesting.
Yeah. And for the LLM, they use OpenAI's GPT-4o, and they set the temperature to 0.0.
Okay.
Which means that it's going to produce deterministic responses.
Right.
So given the same input, the same prompt, the same environment, the LLM is going to give you the same behavioral suggestion every time, which is really important for analyzing the impact of the prompts themselves.
Makes sense.
So the researchers didn't just magically come up with the perfect prompt right away.
Yeah.
They actually went through a really cool iterative process.
Okay.
9 iterations.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see how their understanding of what the LLM needed to know to guide the ants, how that evolved.
Yeah, so at the beginning, their prompts were more general, but they realized that the LLM needed much more explicit instructions on how to make sense of the information from the environment. In those early attempts, the ants wouldn't always follow the pheromone gradients or the nest scent. Sometimes they would even go away from stronger signals.
Right, so they had to introduce these prioritization rules.
Yeah.
So they told the ants to prioritize following the nest scent when they were carrying food because, then their goal is to get back to the colony.
Yeah.
But then if the ant wasn't carrying food, it should focus on following pheromone trails to find food.
Right. And then a really big improvement was when they switched from giving numerical values, like the concentration of pheromones or nest scent, to using these qualitative directional cues.
Oh, interesting.
So instead of saying, pheromone concentration, left 0.2, front 0.8, right 0.1, they said things like higher pheromone concentration front.
Yeah, okay.
And that really helped the LLM guide the ants better.
And then they added instructions for the ants to release pheromones, specifically when they were carrying food. Yes. To reinforce those trails back to the nest.
Yeah.
And they also explicitly said, if you don't have food and you don't smell any pheromones or nest scent, just explore randomly so they can find new food sources.
Right. And then their final prompt got pretty detailed. It gave specific instructions for all the possible actions, like whether to move forward, how to rotate, commands to pick up or drop food, and commands to drop pheromones, all very carefully structured in a Python dictionary so that NetLogo could understand it.
That's super cool.
Yeah. So then they ran simulations comparing 3 scenarios. The original NetLogo model, where the ants just followed the basic pre-programmed rules, a model where every single ant was controlled by the LLM prompts, and then this really interesting hybrid model where half the ants followed the hard-coded rules and half were controlled by the LLM.
Okay, and what did they find?
So they found that in terms of total food collected, the original NetLogo model and the all LLM model were pretty similar.
Okay.
But the LLM model was more consistent.
Oh,
It had a lower standard deviation, so it was a more reliable strategy.
Yeah.
But here's the really cool part.
Okay.
The hybrid model, the mix of rule-based and LLM ants, it actually did better than both of the other models.
Oh, wow.
It collected more food overall, and it even started bringing food back to the nest sooner.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, the researchers don't totally understand why the hybrid model did so well, but it suggests there's something really interesting going on when you combine traditional rules with the adaptability of the LLM. Definitely needs more research.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing they did notice was that the LLM ants, they took a little longer to get back to the nest after finding food compared to the rule-based ants. So maybe there are some small inefficiencies in the LLM's navigation. But on the flip side, the hybrid model was really consistent in how long it took the ants to find food. And when they looked at how many steps it took, both the LLM model and the original NetLogo model, they were more variable. Like some ants took way longer to find food, especially at the beginning.
That's interesting. So let's move on to the second experiment, the bird flocking simulation.
All right, yeah.
So unlike the ants where they used rule-based prompting, this experiment used principle-based prompts. So they were trying to tap into the LLM's understanding of the core principles of flocking.
Yeah.
Separation, alignment, cohesion, like the Boyd's model.
Exactly. So they had a 2D environment designed to replicate the dynamics of flocking.
Yeah.
How birds stay together and move in a coordinated way. They weren't trying to define specific rules for every interaction. It was more about seeing if the LLM could generate flocking behavior just based on these general principles.
Yeah, so they didn't explicitly tell the birds how to react to other birds. The prompts were more about the LLM's knowledge of what it means to flock.
Right. To avoid collisions, align with others, and stay close to the group. And just like with the ants, tuning the prompts was super important.
Yeah.
At first, they had trouble getting the LLM's responses in a format that NetLogo could understand. Sometimes the LLM would include extra text.
Okay.
So they told the LLM to only give its response as a JSON object.
Right.
Which made things a lot cleaner. They also had to make sure that the LLM was using the same compass convention as NetLogo.
Compass convention.
Yeah, in NetLogo, 0 degrees is north, 90 degrees is east, and so on. They had to make sure the LLM was calculating headings the same way.
Okay.
They also added this rationale field to the JSON output, which is cool.
Oh, cool.
It made the LLM explain its reasoning before giving the new heading, like a chain of thought thing.
Yeah.
And finally, they told the LLM to always choose the shortest turn, clockwise or counterclockwise, when adjusting a bird's heading. It sounds like a small thing, but it made the flocking much smoother and more realistic.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So for the results, they compared the original NetLogo model with its rule-based birds to a hybrid model that had 25 rule-based birds and 5 LLM birds. Well, they saw that the differences in heading between birds were pretty similar in both models, so even just a few LLM birds could integrate pretty well.
Okay.
But the LLM birds in the hybrid model tended to stay at the edges of the flocks and keep a bit more distance. Maybe they were being more cautious.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they had a lot fewer collisions than the rule-based birds, which could be because they were keeping more space.
Right.
And they also had, on average, fewer neighbors.
So overall, they were flocking, but maybe in a less tight, less densely packed way.
Exactly, yeah. So what are the takeaways here? I think the biggest one is that LLMs can really drive these swarm behaviors, whether you use rule-based or principle-based prompting.
Yeah.
And as we've seen, prompt design is crucial. Yeah. Even small tweaks can change the whole behavior of the system. And the fact that the hybrid ant colony did so well, I think that's huge. It really suggests that there's potential in combining traditional programming with LLMs.
Yeah, and another key takeaway is that these LLM agents were basically stateless, right?
Right.
They relied on the information in each prompt, which meant the prompts had to be very detailed and specific. Maybe in the future, we could explore giving them some memory.
Yeah, that would be interesting. But of course, this approach also has some limitations. It can be computationally expensive and time-consuming because you're making all these API calls to the LLM.
Right.
The researchers suggest that maybe we could train smaller local models in the future to get around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So overall, this paper, Multi-Agent Systems Powered by Large Language Models, it really opens up a whole new direction in AI research. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that LLMs can simulate these complex behaviors, and in some cases even do better than traditional methods.
For sure. And for our listeners who are, deep into AI, this study really shows just how versatile LLMs are. It's not just about language anymore. And the focus on prompt engineering, it highlights how important it is to communicate with these models in the right way.
Yeah.
And like you said, the hybrid ant colony results, they raise these fascinating questions about how we design intelligent systems in the future.
And the researchers were kind enough to put their code and simulation files on GitHub.
Nice.
It's at https://github.com/warmgpt. So if anyone wants to, explore the technical details, it's a great resource.
So we're left with this big question.
Yeah.
As LLMs get even more powerful, how will they change how we understand and model complex systems?
Right.
Not just in robotics or AI, but in all sorts of fields. Ecology, social sciences, economics. Could we have AI agents that not only mimic what we see, but also help us uncover totally new insights?
That's a really thought-provoking question to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Hopefully this exploration has gotten you thinking and given you some valuable insights. This field is evolving so rapidly, so keep exploring.